All right, well, thank you very much. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Professor Cullison and the philosophy department for inviting me out here. It's really a privilege to be here today. So, my talk is titled, Will the Future Be Like the Past? And it might interest you to know that many philosophers have thought that although we all want to think the answer to this question is yes, it's very, very hard to provide any good reason for thinking that the answer is yes. In fact, we might have a good argument for thinking that it's impossible for us to ultimately provide good reason for thinking this. So the plan for today is basically just to sketch this sort of view, so you can see why it is that philosophers have had this apparently crazy belief. So to begin, I'd like to consider two arguments. So here's the first. All dogs are mammals. Fido is a dog. Therefore, Fido is a mammal. Now these statements, the premises, provide a certain degree of support for this statement, the conclusion. Now, no doubt you'll think that this conclusion is very important. We've learned something really interesting about the world here. No, I'm just kidding about that, right? There is something very interesting about this argument, though, and it's that a careful inspection of the argument suggests that the premises guarantee the conclusion. It's impossible for these two statements to be true while this statement is false. So what that means is that if you can get somebody to believe these two statements, they have to believe this one, practically speaking. Now, if they're inclined to argue with you, you can give a pretty powerful demonstration that, in fact, they're committed to the conclusion. So an intuitive way to demonstrate this is by way of Venn diagrams. So we'll let this circle represent the class of dogs, this circle represents the class of mammals, and the overlapping part of the circle represents things that are both dogs and mammals, right? The intersection of these two classes. Now we can represent the content of expressions from this argument in this diagram. So when we say that all dogs are mammals, what we're saying is that nothing occupies this region of the class of dogs. That region is vacant. So now we've represented the first premise in our little diagram. The second premise, Fido is a dog, this tells us where to put Fido in the logical space. So we have to put Fido in the remaining portion of the class of dogs. So this is where Fido is. Now notice I haven't marked anything down to represent the conclusion, but from an inspection of the conclusion, which says Fido is a mammal, we see that's already contained here in the diagram. It wouldn't be possible for me to put Fido where these premises tell me to put Fido and make the conclusion false. So, in the strongest possible sense, the premises guarantee the conclusion. And we thus have good reason for thinking that this is a good argument. This is a good inference we've made. This is a good way to reason generally. Now, this type of argument is called a deductive argument. Now I'd like to examine second argument here, argument 2. So the first premise, in fact the only premise at this point, is that the sun has risen every day of my life, and the conclusion is that the sun will rise tomorrow. Or if we'd like to be a little bit more modest, we could say the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Now most of us think that this too represents a fairly good way of reasoning, but it's fairly different than this way of reasoning. For one, we can easily imagine ways in which this premise would be true and the conclusion would be false. Maybe there's some large-scale cosmological event that prevents the sun from rising. Let's not talk about the details too much. That's rather scary to think about, right? But this isn't unintelligible. This isn't completely crazy. It's not absurd. It's something that could happen. So you could make this premise true while making this conclusion false. Note also that there are some arguments that have the same form that don't seem like good ways of reasoning. So for example, you might think, this is an example from Bertrand Russell, the chicken who thinks that he can trust the farmer who has fed him every day of his life is making a mistake on the day when he goes to the hand only to have his neck wrung. philosophers like to think about gruesome things. So there's something that's good about this argument, but we need to say more to figure out what that is. It's not a deductive argument, so we can't give this kind of demonstration. And there are some sorts of inference that are like this that turn out to be bad inferences. So we need to do more work to show why, in fact, this ends up being a good argument. Now, this type of argument is called an inductive argument. And the problem of trying to provide a justification for why this is a good inference in this sort of case is called the problem of induction. So my lecture today is really then about the problem of induction. Before I move on to explain the problem, I just want to say something quickly about why we should care about this. So why does this matter? Well, as it turns out, this sort of inference is really, really important. For one, we make this kind of inference all the time in ordinary life. For example, I noticed that you are sitting comfortably in your chairs with no thought that they might cease to support your weight all of a sudden. Right? I think you'll see that most decisions that you make in life are in some way implicitly relying on inferences of this very form. We can also say something similar about sciences. Any sort of application of scientific results to the world in interesting ways is committed to some kind of inference of this form. So what we're ultimately doing here when we challenge the rationality of making this sort of inference is challenging the rationality of many of our most basic beliefs about the world, and also the rationality of much of what we do in the sciences. So this seems to be the sort of thing that really matters. It tells us a lot about how we ought to think about our position in the world with respect to things that we know or justifiably believe. All right, so why is it then that... so we've seen that it's just not straightforward why we should trust this inference. But in fact, a lot of philosophers have thought that we can't solve the problem of induction. There is no story we can tell that suggests or that explains why this kind of inference is reliable. So what I'd like to do now is explain that. So we'll move to section 2 of the handout, Problem of Induction and the Uniformity of Nature. Now to make this argument, or to explain why this inference is good, what we should try to do is see what else can be added in here to make the connection between this premise and the conclusion more clear. And what most philosophers have thought is that we need some sort of premise of the following form. Nature is uniform. In other words, the future will be like the past, the unobserved will be like the observed. Now, if you're giving an argument, you appeal to a premise. In order to convince people to accept the conclusion, you have to give them some reason for accepting the premise. So what we want to do to justify induction is provide reason for thinking that this premise should be accepted. But here's where we encounter a difficulty. In trying to support this premise, we only have two main options at our disposal. We could try to support it by appealing to our experience of the world. Or we could try to support it without appealing to our experience of the world. Now, let's think about the concept of natures being uniform, the futures being like the past. How in general do we try to learn about the world? What sort of steps do we take when we want to know what our world is like, what nature is like? Well, it seems like this is not something that we can do from the armchair. We can't just sort of sit down, relax, think hard about what the world is like, and come up with a clear description of how the world is. It seems like our method of learning about the world is by going out and making observations. This is roughly what is meant by an empirical method. So it seems like we can't learn that nature is uniform independently of experience. We can't learn that nature is uniform by some non-empirical method, so that's just not going to be an option for trying to justify this premise. So what we'll have to do then is provide some sort of empirical support. In other words, we need an argument that has this form. Its conclusion is that nature is uniform. And whatever premises there are up here are going to be empirical premises. Now, the main way that we reason empirically is roughly as follows. We make observations, and then we generalize about them. So in this case, I might say, well, you know, when I've looked around, I've seen that nature tends to be uniform. If I look around, ravens tend to be black, and then I observe more ravens, and they continue to be black. I see that planets tend to have elliptical orbits, and then I discover new planets, and lo and behold, they have elliptical orbits. So it looks like I'm observing the nature is uniform, or something like that. So I can say this. All right, here's my premise. The observed parts of nature are uniform. And that's what justifies my belief that nature in general is uniform. Now this might sound plausible on the surface, but there's a big potential problem here. The type of inference that we're making here looks to be the very same as the type of inference that we made up here. We might phrase this differently by just saying, in the past, nature has been uniform. Therefore, tomorrow, nature will be uniform. And now that it seems to have explicitly the same form as this up here. But if that's the case, it's just another inductive inference. And as we saw, right, initially, there's this question whether inductive inferences are good ones. So what we've done, effectively, is we've pushed the bulge in the carpet down in one place, only to have it reappear in another place. The very problem we're trying to solve has reappeared at this new level. Now, why is this bad? Well, we decided earlier that to make this argument, this sort of argument, a good one, we need the uniformity of nature. So suppose we add that in here. Well, now the argument, it's clear that this is not going to be convincing, right? This premise and the conclusion are the very same thing. It's question-begging. This argument won't convince anybody to trust induction who doesn't already think that we have good reason to trust induction. So to sum up the problem, we can't establish that nature is uniform independently of experience, because that's just not how we learn about nature. Neither can we establish that nature is uniform on the basis of experience, because that seems to require the appeal to induction itself, which means that this method is either circular or question-begging. However, it seems like these are only two main ways of learning about things, either by experience or independently of experience. So that means that we just have no good reason for thinking that nature is uniform, and therefore that we have no good reason for trusting inductive inferences. So this looks pretty bad. So that's a summary of the classical problem of induction. What I'd like to do now is run through, I think we'll do two important responses, two attempts to salvage inductive inferences in light of this sort of problem. I'm going to skip section 4, because I think that's the least interesting one, and I'd like to respect our time constraints. So let's go to section 5. So section 5 is titled The Sampling Procedures Response. And what I'd like to do is describe a certain sort of example to you to illustrate how this is supposed to work. So let's suppose that I have an urn. Don't worry, this is a non-gruesome example. I have an urn full of ping pong balls. Now here's a fact about ping pong balls. They come in exactly two colors, white and orange. Now suppose I offer you a bet. Say, all right, I'm not telling you anything about the distribution of ping pong balls. There are 100 in this urn. Each ball is either white or it's orange. Now, you can make, let's make a $1,000 bet that the 11th ball drawn out of the urn will be a certain color. And I'll let you pick the color right now. Now, with the information you have, you'll probably reason as follows. Well, they can only be two colors. I have no reason to think the 11th ball would be one rather than another, so I'll just guess at random. It's equally likely to be either one, given the information I have. But now suppose I were to do the following. I think you'll recognize that this would not be a very smart thing to do on my behalf, and this is where things get interesting. Suppose I say, all right, Oh, you're not willing to take a $1,000 bet because that's a lot of money on a silly bet like this? Well, maybe I can entice you as follows. I will let you thoroughly stir the pot, right? You can completely randomize the ping pong balls and then draw 10 of them and observe the 10 balls that you've drawn, and then you can decide what bet you want to make. So suppose you do this, you draw your 10 balls at random, and it turns out that all 10 of the balls are orange. So now you get to decide which color you want to bet on. I think that this would be a very silly thing for me to do, right? And we can explain it as follows. You can say, all right, I'm going to take the bet. I'm going to bet that it's an orange ball, and I'm pretty certain that I'm going to win. Here's why. Independently of experience, I can know the following. If it weren't the case that the vast majority of balls were orange, it would be really improbable for me to have drawn 10 orange balls in a row, in the first 10 draws, right? So imagine a case in which 90 balls are white and only 10 are orange. It would be really improbable for you to draw just all 10 orange balls, right? So we know independently of experience that whatever you draw, that sample is going to be, to a certain degree, representative of the overall distribution of balls in the urn. So the thought is this. As long as you have a sufficiently large, random sample, these laws of statistics take over. And they guarantee that the undrawn balls, or the unobserved balls, are likely to resemble the distribution of balls that you've drawn. So what we have here is something that looks like a bridge between the premise of first sort and the conclusion, and it is a premise that we know independently of experience. So you might think, hey, as long as we make observations in life going around doing so randomly, and as long as we have a sufficiently large sample, we'll be in the position to project our past experience onto the future. Because since we're doing so randomly, it would be unlikely that the world would appear the way it is if it weren't that way more generally. Now, I think that in some respects, this is a really promising response. It seems to get something right. But there are two main problems with it, and I think that these problems are sufficiently serious that they show that on its own, this can't allow us to solve the problem of induction. So the first problem has to do with the position we're in as people who are trying to learn about the world. So philosophers would say that this is an epistemic difficulty. Now, in the case, the way that I've described it, why are you so sure that you're getting a random sample? Well, you've stirred the pot, right? And you know that stirring the pot will mix balls around so that it has the effect of being random, right? But how do you know that? The worry is that that kind of knowledge is ultimately going to be based on past experiences. So you'll have to reason like this. In the past, whenever I've stirred the pot, it has randomized my sample. So therefore, this time, it will randomize my sample as well. But that's an inductive inference. It's an inference of the very sort that's at dispute. The second sort of difficulty doesn't have to do specifically with epistemology. It just has to do with the nature of our world. So philosophers would say that this is a metaphysical kind of problem. And it goes like this. In this case, in order for the sample to be random, you have to have an equal chance of drawing every ball in the urn. That's an essential feature of what it is for this to be a random sample. But in real life, if we want to know what things are going to be like in the future, say this is the present moment. Say we're observing ravens, or let's say sunrises. We'll keep it the same. We're observing sunrises. And we say, every day there's a sunrise. What we want to know is about these future potential events that could be happening. But our sample isn't exactly random, because we don't have an equal chance of observing future sunrises. We're just not in the position to do that at all. So, for these two reasons, the epistemic reason and the metaphysical reason, it looks like sampling procedures are not going to be sufficient to help us solve the problem of induction. Okay, so now we come to section 6 of the talk. This is the final section. This response that I'd like to consider now, I think, is the most promising sort of response. I also think it's the sort of response that my students are most drawn to when they first learn about the problem of induction. And it goes like this. All right, let's talk about the sunrise. Now, when I think about the sun rising every day, I don't think that this is just a totally random occurrence. I think there's a causal explanation. I think that the sun has risen every day in the past because the laws of physics, together with the state of things in the world, sort of guarantee that these large, massive bodies will behave in the way that they have in the past. Right? So Newton's laws, for example, can give us a pretty good approximation of how planets and stars behave. And because I think that Newton's laws will continue holding in the future, or as approximations, I think that the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Right? I don't see any large, incoming objects that are going to prevent the sun from rising. I don't see any reason to think that there's going to be some kind of causal interference that will prevent this from happening. So because the laws will extend into the future, so will the sunrise. Now, in this sort of form, there's a classical reply. And the reply is this. To make this inference a good one, we need to be able to project into the future. And that means that we need the claim that the laws will remain the same in the future. But why should we accept that claim? Why think that the laws can't change? Here's a quick little thought experiment to suggest that it is possible that the laws could change. Suppose that, as Isaac Newton thought, the kind of thing that a law of nature ultimately is, deep down at rock bottom, is that a law of nature is a sort of preference in God's mind. So God has a preference that planets have approximately elliptical orbits, and that's what explains the approximately elliptical orbits of planets. But what if God changed his mind? Maybe his preference will change one day, and he'll just decide, different laws today. That seems like it's conceivable. It's conceptually possible in at least some interesting way. And what that suggests is that the concept of a law of nature changing isn't totally far-fetched. Well, this is a big problem for us now, because once we've admitted that it's possible for the laws not to hold, we have to ask, on what grounds do we believe that they hold? Are we justified in thinking that? And the worry is this. If our grounds for thinking that the laws will continue to hold in the future are simply that the laws have remained constant in the past, now we're in trouble. Because once again, we're making an inductive inference. In the past, we've seen that the laws have stayed the same. So in the future, they will continue to be the same as well. So again, we get caught in this kind of circular or question-begging reasoning. Now, I'm almost done, but due to the great importance of inductive reasoning, I prefer to end on a slightly more optimistic note. I don't want to be held responsible for any harms that might befall you if you stop trusting induction when you leave the room. So I think what I want to suggest is that there's something about the laws of nature response that's a little bit more promising than this final worry has suggested. And ultimately, I think that this is the most promising way to try to solve the problem of induction. When we considered what it would mean to have empirical support for thinking that nature is uniform, I did something that might be a little bit artificial. I assumed that the only type of empirical inference we can make is an inductive inference. But in fact, there's another sort of reasoning that we commonly make on an empirical basis that is not straightforwardly an inductive inference. The most common way of thinking about this is that, or the most common term for this sort of reasoning is inference to the best explanation. So this is the type of reasoning that a doctor engages in when she makes a diagnosis. So for example, she might say, all right, the patient's exhibiting certain symptoms. If there were a certain ailment, that would be a good explanation of the symptoms. So we'll treat the patient as if patient has this ailment. So there's something empirical about this inference because it's based on observing certain symptoms, but it's not straightforwardly an inductive inference. It looks a little bit different. So the thought then is that we might have a way out. We might say something like this. All right, we've observed all these uniformities in nature in the past. It would be surprising if they just occurred by chance, so hopefully there's some deeper explanation for them. The deeper explanation, let's suppose, is that there are laws of nature out there that are imposing regularities in the world, that are responsible for them, that are guaranteeing them. For example, you might say, like Newton did, oh, there must be a God out there who is making the world the way that it is, and ensuring that it will be regular. Now this on its own is not quite enough to get the regularities to extend into the future, but there might be some auxiliary reasoning we can do to suggest that God, in this sort of case, would ensure that nature is uniform. So I'll quickly discuss two routes, just so that you can see the structure of this sort of proposal. One option would be this. A lot of theists have thought that whatever sort of being God is essentially unchanging. Right? So God is the way that God is, and there's no sort of change involved. Why? Because God is a perfect being, and a perfect being would never have to change. So if you thought that, you would think, oh, well, God's preferences aren't going to change. So contrary to this earlier thought experiment where we said, oh, God could change his mind, we might think there's reason to think that he wouldn't. The other option is to do something that Descartes did, and say this. God is a good being. God has created us with this strong disposition to trust inductive inferences. Right? We're very strongly inclined to think that there's something good about some of these inferences. God wouldn't have done that if he just intended to change the course of nature at some point, because that would make God a deceiver. So either of these routes, we have some underlying metaphysical reason for thinking that the best explanation of the uniformity of nature is going to be something that is timeless or extends into the future. And that looks like a promising way of trying to solve the problem of induction. One last point. You don't necessarily need to think that laws have anything to do with God. This is just an intuitive way of bringing out a way of trying to argue for this sort of position. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can attend my research talk later. All right, I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much.